Hello, dear friends. It's pleasure to be here and to present a topic about world of propaganda and talk about very challenging issue, how to recognize and deconstruct fakes. Of course, today you talked and listened a lot about cybersecurity. And I will present a little bit different kind of information security. First of all, when we're talking about information war or information warfare, it should be mentioned that this definition or name title information war is like an umbrella definition, because under this umbrella, we have a different kind of war and warfare. And one big part is cyber warfare, and another big part is so-called psychological warfare. And propaganda belongs to this area of psychological war. And in fact, also we could use different definitions, and the psychological war could also be named as war of propaganda or warfare of using propaganda, etc. And today, in our reality, we have a different approach to this question, to this warfare, and more. I could mention that, for example, with different definitions, that it's cyber warfare on one hand and psychological warfare on other hand. It doesn't mean that this kind of warfare didn't connect, because in Lithuania, for example, we have some very interesting examples when principles of cyber warfare was used in purpose of psychological warfare. The first such kind of examples was in April 2017, when hackers attacked content system of BNS, it's Baltic News Services, its main information agency, not only in Lithuania, but in Baltic states, in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And the purpose of this cyber attack was to put inside the system fake message that in Latvia, the US soldiers during exercise was intoxicated by mustard gas, iprit. So it's a very interesting example when these principles of cyber warfare work together with principles of psychological war. But when we're talking about psychological war, it's we should understand these differences between this different kind of war or warfare, modern warfare, because, for example, if in cyberspace the main target could be evaluated as infrastructure, information systems, and so on, in case of psychological warfare, the main target is mind. Of course, people's mind is main target, and it's it is very important thing, because the purpose of this psychological warfare is to affect ways in which we are thinking, affect our thoughts, and way of thinking directly linked to decisions that we made. And here also I could provide a kind of example, hypothetical example, because you could imagine if, for example, if some individuals are sure that, for example, this state, Lithuania or so on, is failed state. Also, I now repeating some kind of propaganda narratives of Kremlin propaganda that Lithuania is failed state. It is impossible to defend Lithuania, and if Russia wants to occupy Lithuania and Baltic states, it will be a very fast armed operation. NATO will not help allies to defend their territory, and so on and so on. If I believe to all of these narratives, in case of real military aggression, my decision could be not to try to defend my land, because if I'm thinking that Lithuania is failed state and not defendable at all, why I should try to defend it? Why I should try to do thing which I think is impossible? So propaganda affects our decisions. Propaganda affects our way of thinking, and through it affects our decisions, how I mentioned. Also, it should be mentioned something about classification of propaganda, and really we have different ways to classify different kind of propaganda, but one of the easiest and maybe one of most common is so-called colors of propaganda. Here you could see that it's only three colors: black, white, and gray. And also here will be quite important note, because quite often when we're talking about propaganda, or when we hear how people talk about propaganda in public sphere, in information sphere, propaganda is recognized as a negative thing. Yeah? But from scientific point of view, propaganda not only a negative definition or negative challenge, because different kind of propaganda could be evaluated also in different ways. And for example, we have so-called white propaganda. Common thing to black, white, and gray propaganda is that propaganda seeks to influence people. It's obvious. But white propaganda have a clear purposes. It promoting positive or right behaviors. And the best example of so-called white propaganda could be social advertising. When also social advertising, for example, using many tools of propaganda, kind of manipulation, play with emotional mood, and so on, so on. But differences from black or gray propaganda is that white propaganda have this positive purpose. Of course, unfortunately, quite often we facing another kinds of propaganda. It means black or gray propaganda. So black propaganda using disinformation, fake information, fake news, and in easiest way, it could be evaluated as totally lie. That means black propaganda is totally lie. But gray propaganda, I write in this presentation that it could be evaluated as most dangerous kind of propaganda. Why? Because gray propaganda mixing different things. Gray propaganda mixing facts with disinformation. What it means that if we have black propaganda could be quite easily debunked because we just should look to facts, compare it to this disinformation, disinformation, and so on. It's in very fast way we could find that it's totally lie, how I mentioned. But gray propaganda using some kind of facts with some kinds of disinformation or maybe changed context, and so debunk gray propaganda is a harder thing. Because when we try starting deconstruct these elements of gray propaganda, we could find facts, we could find real things, but also we will see this or changed context or some false statements which also changing all narrative. And so on, so on. So gray propaganda, I'm evaluating gray propaganda as most dangerous thing, even compared to black propaganda. I mentioned, but in fact, main tool of propaganda, it's manipulation. Propaganda trying to manipulate, to use for manipulation different possibilities, because for example, as I mentioned, if we have this gray propaganda, this mixing real facts with not with fake information, it's also quite obvious example of manipulation. Also, manipulation could be not mixing facts, but maybe changing context or choosing some facts. So in any case, you could see this definition of what manipulation means from Cambridge Dictionary, that manipulation means, in fact, controlling someone or something to your own advantage, utter unfair or dishonesty, unfair or dishonesty. But I think that everyone knows what manipulation means and know how it possibly works. Of course, I named this manipulation as a main tool of propaganda, but propaganda have more different tools and more different ways to act, and with other tools you could see this list of measures of propaganda using defamation, demonization, principles of demonization, manipulations with symbols, manipulations with emotions, manipulations with context or selection of fact. Propaganda using all these tools, and propaganda in some ways playing with information, could play with facts, could spread disinformation. In fact, today in nowadays world, we have different phases of propaganda. So this also, it's not hard to remember examples of course, here in Lithuania, we first of all, we're talking about so-called Kremlin propaganda. It's propaganda, source of this propaganda is our big neighbor, Russian Federation. Russian Federation also has very big experience in propaganda from Soviet times. But this question, does modern Russian propaganda is similar thing as old Soviet propaganda, is really a quite big question. I will talk about it a little bit later. But when we look into this different tools, we also could remember some examples of usage of these tools. For example, defamation, demonization. I could mention that in this tradition of Kremlin propaganda, for example, Baltic states quite often define it as Nazi or neo-Nazi states, which breaking rights of local Russian-speaking population, and so on, so on. Also, it's quite often this manipulation with some symbols, also Nazism. Here we could evaluate not as some kind of historical fact, but some kind of symbol. Propaganda quite often is very emotional. And why, as I mentioned, the main target of propaganda is people's mind. And in fact, in our life, in our existence, we have this like a binary opposition, because what is dominating thing? It's mind or heart, yeah. And mind is like very cold, it's rational, and heart, in fact, is not rational things. Heart is linked to emotions. And main purpose is that when strong emotions affect us, when strong emotions could at some moments just be stronger than our cold mind, yeah. And we losing some kind of rationality at that moment. Emotions in this case are using as this tool of propaganda and tool of influence to as a tool, as I mentioned. Also, we have these manipulations with context and linking to it principles of selection of facts, because it's like a main rule what truth means. Truth is this paradigm or list of facts. If we could say what is truth, what is facts, we know what truth is. But if we're losing some facts from paradigm, we have not full truth, or better to say, we have this maybe propaganda, maybe just half of truth. It could be also provide, I could provide some examples. Kremlin propaganda denying fact of occupation of Baltic states in 1940, and using some historical facts. But yes, in summer 1940 it was elections in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and elected powers ask Soviet Union to ask to join Soviet Union, and Moscow, of course, was agreeing, but Baltic states could and should became part of Soviet Union. But With Kremlin propaganda quite often forgetting some facts. First of all, what at the moment of elections, this Red Army, Soviet Army, was on territory of Baltic states. That Soviet Army, in fact, control situation. But in elections was allowed. But participate in election was allowed only pro-Soviet powers. So if we have just part of facts, we have another image. But if we have all facts, and if we evaluating all facts, image changing, and we have full image, which showing what our membership in Soviet Union, our it means Lithuania and also Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, was not was not will of people of Baltic states. So when we're talking about modern Kremlin propaganda, and here I could back to this question, what is differences when we're talking about, for example, Soviet propaganda and modern Kremlin propaganda? Does it similar things or it's some differences? I should mention that, first of all, modern Kremlin propaganda take and adopt some old narratives from Soviet propaganda, and it was easy to do because these narratives are well known for people in post-Soviet area, in modern Russia. So it was quite easy to remember these narratives, to adopt these narratives, and use it for modern purpose. For example, it's in Soviet time, NATO was obvious enemy of Soviet Union, so so it's not hard to present it for inhabitants of Russian Federation, for example, NATO as this enemy alliance today. But also Soviet propaganda had very strong ideological ground. It was communism ideology. Today, in fact, Russian Federation have any kind of that kind of strong ideology, and it's one point which is different from Soviet times. Also, it's some scientists think and have a theory that if Soviet propaganda, first of all, wants to influence people and influence in a very understandable way, for example, to show what this communistic way of life is the best. Modern Kremlin propaganda trying just doing information house. Also, this information house have own purpose. It means that if we living in an information house, and if we are not sure where is truth, which information is truthful, which is false, we could be very, very easy influenced because we have any pillars. In this information house, we have any pillars. Also, one more tool of propaganda could be, as one more tool of propaganda, could be mentioned kind of primitivization. And I will show you an example. It's a satirical image of well-known Russian artist Vasya Loshkin. But I like this image very much because it illustrating what modern propaganda Kremlin propaganda, what modern Kremlin propaganda means and how it looks like. Because here is homeland in this part, in this colorized part, and here is like a foreign neighborhood. So we in Lithuania and so on in Western world, we are here. And here you could see this example of demonization of Western world, representation of it like a violent, destructive, and of course homeland Russia with some traditional symbols, birch, Sputnik, and Sputnik is a well-known word, Russian word means satellite, but also well-known word in Western tradition and in Western books and so on. You could find this word using in Russian, it means Sputnik. And it explains, for example, why of a source of propaganda, Kremlin propaganda, got name Sputnik, because it's a well-known well-known word, well-known Russian word in around the world. Of course, as I mentioned, it's not example of propaganda. It's a satirical picture which, in fact, presenting concepts of modern Kremlin propaganda in funny way. But it is really good, and it's really showing which kind of image of world could like if you're talking about people who are affected by propaganda, and especially in this case people who living in Russian Federation. So I would not be very I could say that in minds of some people affected by Russian propaganda, the image of the world is quite similar to this satirical image. And of course, it's problem. It's problem of this kind of people. It's also problem of another states which are in target of Kremlin propaganda. And here we going to this main question when we facing some narratives, some examples of propaganda, how to analyze, how to recognize propaganda, which aspects showing for us that we facing propaganda, not another opinion, not maybe some kind of real information, but this disinformation or half of true, or this mixed product of facts and lies. And I will show you one example, and will explain how we could analyze narratives of propaganda. I'm using so-called Laswell's model for to analyze propaganda. It's not only one way. Of course, it's you could find different ways how to work with propaganda or how to analyze propaganda. But from my point of view, it's one of the easiest and quite clear way how to analyze propaganda. First of all, In fact, every act of propaganda could be evaluated as an act of communication. Because when we're talking about propaganda, about such psychological warfare, it's communication. It's communication of some meanings, symbols, narratives, and so on. So for analysis of propaganda, could be implemented analysis of components of communication model. And Harold Laswell in early 70s, he present which so-called communication model. Laswell think that we could analyze every act of communication, deconstructing this act of communication to 5 parts. And you could see that these parts is, we also could use these parts as a questions. Yeah. If we have some narrative, or who is sender of this narrative, and of course content, meaning of narrative, says what in the message. Also channel or channels which spreading this narrative. Important question: who is a receiver, recipient, to whom? And when we're talking about propaganda, maybe most important question: which, with what effect? It means how this narrative or how this message could affect also audience, but maybe broader audience, and which circumstances could be linked to this act of communication or act of propaganda in our case. And how it works, I will show you on one example. This example is quite well known, for example, in Ukraine, in post-Soviet area. And you could see this description of this example on July 12th, 7 years ago, 6.5 years ago. Yeah, Russian television aired an interview with a woman. You could see this woman on picture. She was presented as a refugee from the eastern Ukraine, city of Slaviansk, Galina Pushniak. And she told to Kremlin's official channel 1 that upon entering Slaviansk, it was territory occupied by Russian militias in April of so-called separatists in eastern Ukraine. But Ukrainian armed forces captured the family of one of these rebels, woman and small boy, 3 years old boy, and they made like a public execution of this people. That boy was nailed to a wooden board and crucified and died. And after that, his mother was tied to a tank and dragged around the square until she was dead. So it's a quite well-known example of black propaganda. It was disinformation, and it was totally fake story. And interesting aspect is that this channel 01 later, when it was many evidence but nothing happens in Slaviansk, and that this all story is fake, they recognized that this story not true. But they did not recognize that they spread propaganda. They just write in press release, but journalists just did not check the facts. Yes, it was like a journalistic mistake. But by the way, it also another interesting fact that this video is could be found on this official Channel 1 site. So they not not deleted from the site. It's a very interesting thing. They recognize that it's fake, but they still keeping fake on their own site. So, but I like this example because it's like a recognized example of propaganda. And using this example, we could try to implement this five steps of analysis of propaganda and how it could looks like. Yeah, how could looks like this analysis. I try it present here. So answering to these questions. First of all, also I want to stress that it's not so easy recognize propaganda using just these 5 questions, because for example, if we're talking who is a messenger, who translating this message, or who telling a story, it's Galina Pyshniak, and she was presented as whiteness. It means person who saw these events. For example, in journalism, whiteness every time is potentially truthful source. Of course, if he or she not lying. Yeah. Says that we have narrative. Yeah, and in fact, answering to this question says that we could back to this description. It's content of message. But in this content, we could see some kind of or footsteps of tools of propaganda. Of course, I didn't show here this video, but this story which Galina Pyshniak she telling it very emotionally. Of course, we could say that if it's story about crucified boy and in fact military crime, you could not told it easy and in calm way. Of course, it should be emotional, but also we have kind of symbols, crucifixion and so on. This could be like this first point, which should be a signal, but maybe we have here this propaganda, not real information, but kind of narrative of propaganda. Another this signal or point is what Channel 1 is linked to the Kremlin. It's linked to state power. Also, it could be evaluated as quite known source of propaganda, because we have previous precedents. For example, already 8 years ago, with Channel 1 repeated Soviet propaganda narratives about tragical events in Vilnius in January 1991. So we had a precedence. We could say that this channel sometimes spreading disinformation narratives of propaganda, so we could not evaluate it as trustworthy source of information. So we should check. We should be critical in this situation. For whom? To whom? Audience of, first of all, of course, audience of channel one. It's people who potentially lives in so-called this information bubble of Kremlin propaganda. So that kind of story just just supporting the image of the world which they have. It's supporting this story, supporting another narratives of propaganda. But when we're talking about audience, of course, today it's maybe a little bit complicated thing, because yes, first of all, this key audience is watchers of channel one, audience of this channel one. But as I mentioned, this video is also put it to the site of this channel one. It's you could watch this video in internet. So potentially it's a broader audience. It's Russian-speaking people around the world. And we know these possibilities of internet, possibilities of a global world. So translated to other languages, this story could be spread in other space of information, in space of information of another countries. So potentially audience is very, very broad, and it's global. And which that effect, of course, it's in fact, we could say that in this narrative, Ukrainian army was accused of military crime. Also effect, as I mentioned, it supports our narratives of propaganda about COP in Kiev. We should remember that this case was happened in 2013. It's in fact after Maidan. It's first months after events. Sorry, this is my cat. So it's first events after Maidan and occupation of Crimea, events in Donbass. So it's everything very hot. This information is hot. So it's this narrative supports this other narratives of propaganda, or, for example, about danger for Russian-speaking people in Ukraine or in post-Soviet area, and so on and so on. But this analysis on this stage not allow to us say that look, yes, really it's a case of propaganda, or it's example of propaganda. We should make some additional work, and question is about evidence. It's elements of debunk of the story. So what we have only one witness, no other people who were telling this kind of story. But in story, it was mentioned that people from this city was collected on one square to look to this execution. So it should be many witness in this case, but we have only one. No video and photo evidence. And today it's a very important thing, because we are living in era of smartphones. Everyone, or around everyone, many people have smartphones with a function of video recording, of photo. So if something really happens, such kind of events, it would be many evidence, photo and video evidence in internet. I'm sure. Some very interesting inaccuracies in details of story. It was not mentioned in this description of story, but when this false witness telling story, she mentioned that people was collected on Lenin Square. Square of name of Vladimir Lenin. It's head of communist coup in Russia in 1918. and it's very interesting because in Slaviansk, it's they have no any Lenin Square, and it's never been. I think that in Soviet time, of course, it maybe was this Lenin Street or something, but Lenin Square doesn't exist in Slaviansk, and it's not existing. So, and this witness, she represents himself as a local inhabitant of the city. So she's showing that she just does know geography of her own city. And of course, we have here, as I mentioned, visible footprints of propaganda tools and techniques. And when we are making such kind of debunk of deconstruction, in fact, we could say that, look, this information is false. It's fake story. It's fake story with quite clear purpose. It's to demonize, to defame Ukrainian army, to affect image of Ukrainian army, to show not real context of events in Donbass, and so on and so on. I showed these principles of debunking of narratives of propaganda, and in fact, this activities that in Lithuania, but today around the world, making analysts and journalists, because truth matters, and truth matters and fact matters, because facts and truth allow us to make right decisions. How I mentioned, propaganda tries to target our mind, target our way of thinking, and when we have just false information, we are making false decisions. So here I want thank you, and I am ready to answer to some questions if you will have. Thank you.